Imagine a quiet night in Paris, just after midnight. The air is cool and the city of lights is starting to settle. But behind the Ritz Hotel, a black Mercedes is idling. The door shuts. Vroom, the engine hums. It's 12:20 a.m. Inside that car is the most photographed woman in human history. She thinks she's finally escaping the lenses. She's wrong. Within 23 minutes, the world as we knew it would stop. Gone. Now, we've all heard the official reports. We know about the high-speed chase, the tunnel, and the tragic statistics. But here's the thing. Have you ever wondered why? Not just why the car crashed, but why millions of people who never met her, never spoke to her, felt a physical ache in their chest when the news broke. It's easy to blame the paparazzi. It's easy to point at the flashing lights that hunted her like a trophy. But if we're being honest, if we look at the logic from the other side, weren't we the ones buying the magazines? The most watched woman was only watched because we couldn't look away. There's a bit of a cold truth there, isn't it? We loved her, but our love was also the cage. You see, Diana wasn't just a princess. She was a mirror. When she suffered, we saw our own heartbreaks. When she walked through a minefield, we felt our own fears. She broke the stiff upper lip of the British monarchy and replaced it with a human heartbeat. So, before we talk about how she died, we need to understand the life that made her death feel like a personal loss to 2.5 billion people. It didn't start with a crown. It started with a little girl in a big, cold house who felt, she felt like she didn't quite belong. Park House, Sandringham, 1961. It sounds like the opening of a classic British novel, doesn't it? The address was prestigious, literally on the Queen's own estate. But if you stepped inside, the air wasn't filled with royal grandeur. It was heavy with a very specific kind of silence. The silence of disappointment. You see, Diana's parents, the Althorpes, were desperate, not for money or status, but for a boy. They'd already had 2 daughters, and then a son, John, who tragically died just hours after he was born in 1960. The grief was immense, but the aristocratic pressure to produce a male heir was even bigger. So, when Diana arrived a year later, she wasn't the savior the family wanted. She was just another girl. They didn't even pick a name for her for an entire week. Think about that for a second. For 7 days, the most famous woman in the world was just a nobody. That sting, that feeling of being a replacement or not quite enough, it didn't just go away. It became the foundation of who she was.
Now, here's the logic that people often miss. We look at her titles and her mansions and we think privilege. But privilege is a cold comfort when your home life is falling apart. When Diana was only 6, her parents went through a brutal divorce. Her father won custody, and she was left in that big house, listening to the echoes of a family that wasn't there anymore. She later described those years as very unhappy and very unstable. She struggled in school, failing her exams twice. Conventional society would have labeled her a failure back then. But while she couldn't pass a history test, she was winning prizes for kindness. She was volunteering in care homes, while other girls were focused on debutante balls. This is where the Diana magic actually started. It didn't come from a crown. It came from the fact that she knew exactly what it felt like to be overlooked. She didn't learn empathy from a textbook. She learnt it from the hollow feeling in her own chest. By 18, she was living in a flat in London, working as a nanny and a kindergarten assistant. She was happy. She was normal. She was a young woman with no idea that the man who would save her was about to walk into her life and change her quiet loneliness into a very, very loud kind of tragedy. If you look back at the footage from February 1981, you'll see a 19-year-old girl with a shy smile and a massive sapphire ring. A reporter asks, "Are you in love?" Diana says, "Yes, of course," without a second thought. But then Prince Charles adds 4 words that still haunt royal history: whatever "in love" means. Now, we usually look back and think, how did she not see the red flags? But here is the logic we often ignore. Diana wasn't being recruited for a romance, she was being recruited for a job. The palace didn't need a soulmate for Charles, they needed an asset. She was young, she was aristocratic, and crucially, she didn't have a complicated romantic past. She was a blank slate they could write the monarchy's future on. But Charles's heart was already written on. It belonged to Camilla Parker Bowles. Here's a perspective people rarely talk about. Was Charles the villain, or was he just another prisoner of the same system? He was a man in his 30s told he couldn't marry the woman he loved because she wasn't suitable. So he found a girl who was. It was a cold, institutional decision that led to a very human disaster.
The night before that fairy tale wedding, Charles reportedly told Diana he didn't love her, he wanted to be honest. Can you imagine the weight of that? You're 20 years old, your face is on every commemorative plate in the country, and the man you're about to marry tells you his heart isn't in it. But the show had to go on. July 29th, 1981, St. Paul's Cathedral. 750 million people are watching on TV. Diana walks down the aisle in a silk taffeta gown with a 25-foot train. It's the most watched broadcast in history. But while the cameras were focused on her smile, Diana's eyes were scanning the pews. She wasn't looking for friends, she was looking for a pale grey hat. She found it. Camilla was there. Diana later said that image was seared into her mind forever. Within months, the fairy tale turned into a ghost story. Diana struggled with severe postnatal depression and an eating disorder, bulimia, which she used as a secret language to communicate the pain she couldn't say out loud. The palace didn't see a medical cry for help, they saw a behavioral problem. They thought she was unstable. In reality, she was just the only person in the room who refused to pretend that everything was okay. She was the third person in a marriage that was only meant for 2. And she was about to realize that if she couldn't find love inside the palace, she would have to find it somewhere else. And that somewhere else turned out to be every single one of us. By 1992, the walls were closing in. The palace wanted silence, but Diana, well, she had a voice that couldn't be caged anymore. While the world saw a smiling princess on tour, she was sitting alone in her room at Kensington Palace, recording her life onto secret tapes for biographer Andrew Morton. This wasn't just gossip, it was a survival strategy. She spoke about the eating disorders, the mental health struggles, and the cold loneliness that lived inside those palace walls. When the book, Diana, Her True Story, hit the shelves, it didn't just rattle the palace, it blew the doors off. But the real earthquake, that happened 3 years later.
November 1995. A journalist named Martin Bashir sneaks recording equipment into her home under the guise of installing a new hi-fi system. No one in the royal family knew. Not even the BBC's own board was in the loop. When the cameras rolled, Diana didn't play the victim. She played the truth. Over 200 million people worldwide tuned in. Think about that for a second. In an era long before social media, 200 million people sat in their living rooms to hear one woman say, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." Now here's a logic check. The palace called her unstable for doing this,
But was it instability, or was it the most courageous, calculated act of rebellion in royal history? She knew the consequences. She knew the palace would be enraged, and they were. Within a month, Queen Elizabeth herself wrote to Charles and Diana, urging them to finalize their divorce without further delay. In August 1996, it was over. She lost her Royal Highness title. The institution tried to strip away her status, but here's the irony. The less royal she became on paper, the more regal she became to the world. She was 35 years old. She was finally free. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't just a princess of the palace, she was becoming the princess of the people. Once the divorce papers were signed in 1996, Diana did something no one expected. She didn't retreat into a quiet life of luxury. Instead, she stepped into the world with a new kind of power. Not the power of a crown, but the power of a human touch. Think about the late 80s, the height of the AIDS crisis. Fear was everywhere. People thought you could catch it just by being in the same room. But in 1987, Diana walked into the first dedicated HIV/AIDS ward in the UK and did something revolutionary. She sat down, she looked a patient in the eye, and she shook his hand. No gloves, no hesitation. Click. That photograph did more to crush the stigma of AIDS than a decade of public health posters ever could. She didn't just lend her name to charities, she lent her soul. She sat in homeless shelters, she held the hands of leprosy patients. And then, in early 1997, she walked into a boneyard in Angola. She put on a ballistic vest and walked through a partially cleared landmine field.
Now, here's a logic check. Why would the most famous woman on earth risk her life for a piece of dirt in Angola? Because she knew that if the cameras were on her, the world had to look at the children who had lost their limbs to those mines. It wasn't royal duty, it was a choice, and it worked. 4 months after she died, 122 nations signed the treaty to ban landmines. That is her real monument. But what about her heart? Behind the scenes, she was searching for a normal kind of love. For 2 years, she was deeply involved with a heart surgeon named Hasnat Khan. Her friends said he was the one. He was private, unglamorous, and he saw the woman behind the princess. But the storm of her fame was too much for him. The relationship ended in mid-1997. By that summer, she was on a yacht in the Mediterranean with Dodi Fayed. He was charming. He was comfortable with the cameras. For a few weeks, Diana looked happy. She was 36 years old, finally living a life that actually belonged to her. But that summer happiness was about to collide with a cold, hard reality in a tunnel in Paris. The paparazzi weren't just following her anymore, they were hunting her, and the world's hunger for a photograph was about to become the very thing that took us away from us. August 31st, 1997, 12:23 a.m., the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. The Mercedes was moving at nearly 100 miles per hour when it struck the 13th concrete pillar. Dodi Fayed and the driver, Henri Paul, were killed instantly. But here's the detail that makes you stop. The only survivor, the bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones, was the only one wearing a seatbelt. Diana and Dodi weren't. We often think of these events as destiny, but when you look at the forensic facts, the speed, the lack of seatbelts, and a driver with a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit, it wasn't destiny. It was a series of human failures.
And then there's the paparazzi. They didn't put down their cameras to help. They stood there in the smoke and the wreckage, taking pictures of a dying woman through the shattered glass. Prince Harry later said the hardest thing to live with was knowing that the last thing his mother saw on this earth was the flash of a camera. So,
Diana was pronounced dead at 4 a.m. She was 36. What followed wasn't just news, it was a collective emotional breakdown. In London, over 1 million bouquets were left outside Kensington Palace. The flowers were 30 feet deep in some places. Now, here's the logic check. Most of these people had never met Diana. So why the grief? Because Diana had become a constant presence in our lives, a friend we only knew through a lens. When she died, it felt like a gap had opened in the world itself. While the public wept, the royal family stayed silent at Balmoral. They followed protocol, grieving privately, keeping the flag at full mast. But the public didn't want protocol. They wanted a human response. This was the moment the monarchy almost broke. It took several days of public fury before the Queen finally returned to London and lowered the flag. At the funeral, 2.5 billion people watched on TV. They saw 2 young boys, 15 and 12, walking behind their mother's coffin. Inside the Abbey, Earl Spencer delivered a eulogy that did something unheard of. It criticised the institution Diana had married into. When he finished, the sound of applause from the crowds outside rolled into the church. It was the first time applause had ever been heard at a funeral in Westminster Abbey. So, what is the Diana legacy? Is it the conspiracy theories? No. The real legacy is the 1997 Landmine Treaty. It's the way we talk about mental health today. It's the fact that the British royal family is now more accessible and human because she forced them to be. She was the most watched woman in the world, but in the end, she was just a woman who wanted to matter. And 30 years later, looking at those 1 million flowers, it's clear she still does.